Good morning, I'm Diane Macedo. Today on ABC News Live, the Buffalo grocery store shooting suspect has pleaded guilty. He's now the first person in state history to be convicted of domestic terror motivated by hate, what it means for his sentencing. Hundreds of flights are delayed as people are still trying to get home from the holiday. We're at LaGuardia Airport with tips and tricks to avoid the long line. And it's Cyber Monday. Alexis Christophers is here with the top sellers, the shopping trends, and where you can find the biggest discounts today. But we begin with that case in Buffalo. The supermarket mass shooter has now pleaded guilty to state charges. He's the first person in state history to be charged with domestic terrorism motivated by hate after allegedly killing 10 black people and wounding several others in what police call a racially motivated attack. I want to bring in ABC News senior investigative reporter Aaron Katersky and host and legal analyst at Law and Crime Network, Terry Austin, for more on this. Thank you both for being here. Terry, he's now pleaded guilty to murder, attempted murder, several counts of both, a gun charge, and of course the big one. He's now the first person to be convicted of domestic terror motivated by hate. Why do you think he changed his plea from not guilty, knowing this carries most likely a sentence of life without parole?
I think he is calculating what is going to happen with those federal charges. And the DOJ has the option in that case to bring the death penalty. And so by pleading guilty here to all of these charges, I think he's hoping that it's going to help him later on. He'll have the life without parole sentence in all likelihood, and it will make it a lot easier for the DOJ to say, okay, we may not bring the case at all. Or we may bring the case and not charge with death because he has pled guilty to these charges, and maybe he'll plead guilty in the federal case as well. So it's a calculated move, in my opinion.
And we just showed a picture of all of the victims. We heard, Aaron, the Erie County District Attorney John Flynn go through one by one, describe every single individual shooting that happened here, and then say at the end, he did this because the victim was African American. Why was motive such a key piece to this case?
Because it tells us so much about the suspect. And I remember at the time John Flynn telling me when the indictment was first returned that he wanted to make sure it was 10 individual counts to account for each of the victims as a person. And you heard him call Peyton Gendron a racist murderer who planned and carried out a racially motivated attack based on white supremacist ideology that specifically targeted black people. The DA invoked the domestic terror motivated by hate statute because to him it was the evident choice here. It was an act of domestic terrorism. It was based on an ideology that the shooter espoused in a 180-page screed that also mentioned prior mass shooters and said his main goal was to kill as many black people as possible, not to die, and to spread messages of hate beyond just Buffalo.
Now, Terry, he's now due to be sentenced in February. Flynn made it sound like this is a formality. We don't even legally need to do it because he is going to get life without parole. How cut and dry is that?
Well, he seems to think it's cut and dry, and I think it is fairly cut and dry, but it is some wiggle room there. I mean, the statute literally says, notwithstanding any other provision of the law, the sentence shall be life imprisonment without parole. And that notwithstanding any other provision of law, in my humble opinion, means that you could look at the federal sentencing guidelines. Has he had any other convictions? Take his age into consideration. He could also have individuals who come speak on his behalf at the sentencing. So, because the statute is so strong and says shall be life without parole, I do think it'll probably be automatic, but nothing is in black and white and anything could happen. So, that's why I don't think it is a definite life without parole.
Terry, we also heard the prosecution there describe how, despite this guilty plea, they still in court decided to take the extra step of showing how they would have proven this case had it gone to trial. What did you make of that?
Well, the judge has to accept this plea deal, essentially. I mean, he's pleading guilty, and the judge wants to hear all of the evidence against him and understand why, in fact, he is pleading guilty. So it is like a little mini trial. They have to show what their proof is to get to this point. And frankly, they convinced the defendant and his attorneys that this was the only option, that there's so much evidence. There's those Google searches, there's the visits to the store to map out what he was going to do and all of the videos. So I think they wanted to prove to the court and to the defendant and to the attorneys and to the community that, in fact, there is evidence and you should be pleading guilty. There is no other choice here.
So there you go. Buffalo shooter guilty on state charges. He has pleaded guilty, likely to be sentenced to life without parole in February. But, of course, he still faces federal charges as well. We will continue to watch that investigation. Aaron Katersky, Terry Austin, thank you both. And now to millions of Americans heading home from the holiday weekend. Travelers are now facing delays and cancellations at the airport. ABC News transportation correspondent Gio Benitez is at LaGuardia Airport with more on that. Hi, Gio.
Some airports saw delays of over 2 hours because of that rough weather, but the roads, they were simply packed. Take a look at these images now, because the nearly 50 million people who drove getting stuck in traffic, especially in the Northeast. And in the air, even with those delays, a very low number of flight cancellations, just a few dozen among the U.S. airlines. Now remember, Sunday was the day all of those people who traveled for Thanksgiving were returning home together. Now the airlines clearly making changes after a summer of travel chaos because of weather and staffing issues. Now, this is now the closest we've come to pre-pandemic travel numbers. Just look, an estimated 54.6 million travelers this Thanksgiving. In 2019, 55.3 million. And so far today, we are seeing even less flight cancellations than yesterday, but keep an eye on that weather, Diane.
All right, Gio, thank you. And health officials are issuing a new warning as more than 3/4 of the nation's pediatric beds are full. Hospitals are reporting a surge in patients seeking urgent care, and concerns are growing over a shortage of certain medications. Chief Innovation Officer at Boston Children's Hospital and ABC News medical contributor Dr. John Brownstein is here with more on this. Dr. Brownstein, we're hearing about a rise in flu, COVID still going around, a surge in RSV. So if you start developing respiratory symptoms, how do you know what it is, and how do you know when it's time to go to the hospital?
Yeah, it's a great question, Diane. You know, this is all part of the seasonal mix that we've experienced for years, the RSV, flu, rhinovirus, parainfluenza, enterovirus, and now we have COVID. Ultimately, it doesn't matter too much because most people recover just fine with rest and fluids. The data is important for public health surveillance to understand which viruses are circulating. It's really hard to determine which virus you have without a test. RSV obviously is impacting our youngest kids with wheezing and cough. Flu, has a distinctive high fever. COVID impacts, parts of the body beyond your lungs. And of course, we have the loss of taste and smell, though that's less likely with Omicron. So it's really about managing symptoms at home, drinking those fluids, moist air, over-the-counter pain relievers. And as symptoms get worse, that's when you have to call your doctor. That's when maybe an emergency room visit is important, but hopefully hold off, until it's really necessary, because our hospitals are incredibly crowded right now.
They sure are. What do you make of this figure? 78% of pediatric hospital beds across the country are full. How worried are you about that?
I'm very worried about that, Diana. It's something that we're tracking, and we'll have some new numbers today, and hopefully we'll see some relief. And what's concerning is that RSV, in our kids. Now, ultimately, we're seeing a decline in RSV, which is really great news, but the decline in RSV is coming with a surge in flu. And I'm worried about the mixing of people, mobility during Thanksgiving, like we've seen for the last several years, and how that can take off COVID. Well, I think that will, be an accelerant for flu. And so I think we'll have this trade-off between RSV and flu. And unfortunately, I think our hospitals will continue to be crowded for the next several weeks to months.
Is this what we have to expect for winter now, or do you see this easing up anytime soon?
Well, this is something that we experience, every year. Being in a pediatric hospital, we experience, this winter surge every year, and we can handle it. Though what's happened this year is it's much earlier, and it's, a rise in cases beyond what we've expected. Now, with RSV, it was more than what we've seen in many years. Flu, it's also, record-breaking numbers. And then you have COVID, which is not something we've had historically. So this is what I'm worried about for the future. We need to think about rearranging our health systems to handle these surges. I think there's a lot of investment in both health systems and public health to make sure that we deal with, these cases, ultimately with vaccination, behavioral changes, right? Staying home when you're sick, masking, maybe that becomes the norm. There's ways that we can counter these surges in the future if everybody gets behind them.
All right, Dr. John Brownstein, we appreciate it as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie.
And And Georgians are headed to the polls for the second time in a month. Early voting is underway for the Senate runoff between incumbent Democrat Raphael Warnock and Republican challenger Herschel Walker. The election could determine whether the Senate remains split at 50-50 with the vice president as the tiebreaker, or if Democrats will hold a one-seat majority. ABC's Jay O'Brien joins me live from Capitol Hill now with more. Jay, how crucial is this race, being that Democrats already have control of the Senate? What's at stake?
Yeah, that one-seat majority would mean a lot, Diane, to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. It's because that over the last few months, a lot of Americans learned the names of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema because they were often those Democratic holdout votes. For Manchin specifically, big legislation sometimes had to be tailored to his liking because he was the holdout vote. Now, if Democrats maintain that Warnock seat, have that 51-seat majority, then at that point they would be able to essentially say to Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin that one of you doesn't have the power that you used to have because we've got that extra seat, that extra breathing room. It's worth pointing out in Georgia, early voting is underway right now. About 181,000 people have already voted early. A lot of that has been in person, but there's still a lot of runway to go. There's 200,000 vote-by-mail ballots that have still not been returned.
Meanwhile, Republicans have already secured control of the House for next year. They've said they plan to investigate President Biden's son, Hunter, but Congressman Mike Turner downplayed that in an interview with our Martha Raddatz on This Week. I want to play that clip for you.
One thing that's going to be very, very positive about this Congress is we're going to get back to the committees working again. And with the committees working, they're going to be focusing on their areas of jurisdiction. We're going to take the Intelligence Committee from what was an impeachment committee, a partisan committee, back to national security. Now, there certainly are issues with respect to Hunter Biden's laptop that are going to have to be looked at.
Impeachment issues, you believe?
No.
Not at all.
The impeachment issue was Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, and where our committee was taken off the rails. Our committee is going to focus on national security and our adversaries.
So, Jay, I want to contrast that to the first press conference House Republicans held after winning control of the House, where it was really focused on Hunter Biden. So is there a disconnect within the party on this?
Well, you certainly hear from some Republicans that they don't want to spend all of their time conducting investigations, particularly newer Republicans or more moderate Republicans. But the vast majority of the GOP conference, some of them are chomping at the bit to begin these investigations. You saw Jim Jordan of Oversight and the chair of Judiciary as well have that first press conference right after Republicans take back the House, talking about the Hunter Biden laptop, walking through what they say they have uncovered. Obviously, they expect to hold hearings. So there is a great deal of Republicans who are ready to begin these investigations. It's worth pointing out, by the way, on This Week, on that panel that you just saw, there was also Representative Mike McCall, who's the ranking Republican on Foreign Affairs, and he talked openly about his desire to open a Afghanistan withdrawal investigation very early on into the new Congress.
Meanwhile, the Senate is set to take up a final vote on the marriage equality bill in the coming days. What's the latest on that?
So there is a procedural vote today on an amendment. Democrats want to get a final vote passed by Thursday. It looks like all lights are go on that, and that will likely happen. But then it's got to go back to the House because there were changes made in the Senate in order to make it passable in the Senate. It's got to be voted on again in the House, and only then can it go to President Biden's desk for his signature.
All right, Jay O'Brien, we appreciate it. Thank you. And Ukrainian President Zelensky is urging his people to brace for more Russian attacks. Moscow is escalating attacks on Ukraine's energy system, plunging entire cities into darkness and freezing cold. ABC News' Inez de la Quatara has the latest from Kyiv. Hi, Inez.
Russians really zeroing in on the Ukrainian power grid, leaving millions without power, without heat, without water over the weekend. Workers scrambling to get the power back up and running. But in order to avoid overstressing the grid, blackouts have been imposed, meaning residents in some parts are only getting access to a few hours of power or heat a day. And this comes as, of course, Kyiv is covered in snow. You can see it behind me. Temperatures continue to drop. This is really Putin weaponizing winter, trying to make people's everyday lives as miserable as possible so that they in turn will pressure the Ukrainian government to negotiate. Ukrainians, though, remain undeterred. We're seeing incredible images coming out of kids going to school with flashlights, doctors operating in the dark, diners eating in restaurants by candlelight. One man telling a member of our team that he is willing to deal with no power, no heat, no water as long as there are no Russians. And Kyiv's mayor kind of talking about that, speaking to local media. He said he doesn't expect there will be any kind of mass evacuations because of the cold, because of the lack of power. He thinks there could be relocations to the suburbs, for instance, should the suburbs have power, but that he doesn't expect that people will actually leave the country because of these blackouts, Diane.
All right, Inez, thank you. And China is easing some of its zero COVID restrictions. The move comes after protests erupted across the country, including some demanding President Xi Jinping step down. ABC News foreign correspondent Maggie Rulli has the latest.
The biggest wave of unrest to hit mainland China in decades is ripping across the country. Fed up with the government's strict zero COVID policies, thousands have taken to the streets from Shanghai to Beijing and at dozens of universities across the country. Shouting, "We want democratic rule of law. We want freedom of speech." Many holding up blank pieces of paper, a symbol of the growing movement designed to avoid arrest and call out censorship as they protest the lockdowns. And some in Shanghai calling for the country's president, Xi Jinping, to step down. A rare and brazen act of public defiance against the communist government, and on a nationwide scale not seen across China since the days of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. The protest triggered by a deadly apartment fire last week in the western city of Urumqi, killing 10. Many blaming COVID restrictions for the fire department's slow response time, something the Chinese government denies. Police facing off with protesters as state media reports that the war against the pandemic must go on. This BBC reporter says he was beaten simply for covering the story. Now, that British journalist was arrested, but has since been released and is back out covering these protests. Now, Diane, there does appear to be some changes happening. Overnight, a number of cities throughout China began tweaking their COVID rules almost in real time. Some lifting lockdowns, other easing testing requirements, perhaps in an attempt to defuse these protests. Diane.
All right, Maggie Rulli, thank you. Coming up, classes are resuming at the University of Idaho today after the unsolved murder of 4 college students. We have the latest on the investigation after this. Welcome back. Classes are resuming at the University of Idaho today after the unsolved murder of 4 college students living off campus. The police presence on campus is heavy, with the killer still on the loose. Kana Whitworth has the latest.
Concern and worry escalating in this tight-knit Idaho town. Police reporting an influx of 911 calls, telling ABC News, "We understand there is a sense of fear within our community."
I think it's important for everybody to come back to campus, but also I understand the fear.
This as college students return to campus, where over 2 weeks ago, 4 students were found brutally stabbed to death in their off-campus home. This student, who lives just down the street from where the gruesome murders took place, packing his things and heading home with his father.
It's just an eerie feeling. Moscow just doesn't feel the same right now.
The university now offering remote learning and asking Idaho State Police to enhance security presence on campus. Police maintaining this was a targeted attack, saying they have collected nearly 500 online tip submissions since the FBI link was published last week. Steve Gonzalez, father of 21-year-old Kaylee Gonzalez, telling ABC News that he is appreciative and trusting of the police, but frustrated by the few details they're choosing to release to the public.
Quite frustrated with it because there's a lot of things that we're holding, and I'm not just the only one holding information. My main request for those police officers is just to do everything you possibly can.
Police also addressing similarities between the case and 2 other unsolved stabbings, including a 1999 double stabbing in Pullman, Washington, less than 10 miles away. And just last year, a couple stabbed in their beds at 3 a.m. while they slept. The attack happening in nearby Salem, Oregon. And despite the woman surviving, the case remains unsolved.
I think we're looking at every avenue.
In a statement, police saying there does not appear to be any evidence to support the cases are related. Grieving and determined, Kaylee's father is working to keep the spotlight on this case to find the killer.
I have to get justice. That's the only thing I can do. I owe that to my daughter.
And Diane, authorities tell me they understand the legitimate concerns of those families, adding that their top concern is also bringing them justice. Now, there is a candlelight vigil held this week, but of course, they still have no suspect and they have no murder weapon. But Diane, they do say their investigation is starting to broaden as they get those results back from the crime lab. Diane.
All right, thanks to Kana Whitworth. Thank you. And coming up, the best items to shop for this Cyber Monday and where to get the best deals. We have all the online shopping tips and tricks for you when we come back. Welcome back. Cyber Monday is here with shoppers scouring the internet for the best deals. The National Retail Federation predicts roughly 63 million people will shop online today after millions hit the malls on Black Friday. ABC News business reporter Alexis Christophers is here with a look at the trends so far. So, Alexis, what do these early numbers tell you? What can we expect from Cyber Monday?
I was actually a little surprised at how much people were shopping all over the weekend. I mean, we're dealing with high inflation. We keep talking about it. We're paying more for just about everything. But more than 60% of Americans did say that the economy is still going to impact their holiday shopping plans. Still, we saw in-person visits to the stores up 3% this Black Friday versus last year. I was one of them. I went to a mall in upstate New York. And, you know, I didn't see a lot of people doing a lot of shopping, although it was more crowded. I think they were doing what I call social shopping. They were sort of out there looking at things, turning it into an outing. They were going out to dinner. Restaurant sales were actually up pretty big this past weekend. But when they decided to shop, they did it online. You see right there, online sales hitting a record high on Black Friday, up to $9.12 billion. Today, we're expecting it to be even better. Sales could top $11.2 billion. If they do, that would be a record.
Now, what are some of the early top sellers? Are you seeing any trends in terms of what people are buying?
Yes, it's electronics, anything Apple, Apple Watch, Apple MacBook. Also, we found out today that a lot of the Apple iPhones, you're going to have a hard time getting them because of the COVID lockdowns right now in China and because of the protests going on. There are supply chain issues, so people are trying to buy those early. Drones are really popular. Gaming is popular. The Xbox, the FIFA 23 game, I guess, with the World Cup out now, that's sort of top of mind.
Where are you seeing some of the biggest discounts?
Consumer electronics, again, especially computers. I think we're doing so many things on our mobile phones. They're really discounting those computers. Toys heavily discounted, and clothing. I saw clothing up to 60% off, and in some stores, buy one, get two free. I had to check that sign a couple of times, but that was for real. Also, some of the items we couldn't find during the height of the pandemic, like the paddle boards, fire pits, kayaks, all that outdoor stuff, the retailers are stuck with it, so they're trying to move it out of the stores.
All right, we'll take that. Online scams, I should say, unfortunately, are also at an all-time high at this time of year. And this year particularly. So how do we protect ourselves when we're shopping online?
Great question, important question. So many of us are on social media, so you want to be really suspicious of any social media ads and email ads. That's a gold mine for these scammers. Make sure that you're dealing with a legitimate retailer. If the deal seems to be too good to be true, that's because it probably is. We also have a lot of, this time around, a lot of them are coming out with these fake emails saying your credit card transaction failed. You now need to pay us via Venmo or PayPal. That is not a legitimate. Look for misspellings in the website address. That is also a sign that it's a fake. And if you are asked to create an account or check out as a guest if possible. It's not a scam, but you don't want to keep your personal information on the server of a retailer.
Good advice. Alexis Christophers, thank you.
You bet.
And thank you for joining us. I'm Diane Macedo. Do stay with us as ABC News Live continues with more news, context, and analysis.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.